today's workshop day, our first workshop, educational programs. Don's found a bunch of speakers and companies that are going to give you information today. And one of them is we have Chris Wilson, who's here. Brian Hall and him had Hallson Gardens in Cement City, Michigan. It had a wide selection of perennials, ornamental grasses, companion plants of hostas, and over 200 varieties of hostas. Chris has often carried out studies of hosta diseases. He has been a keen advocate, particularly for informing people about hosta virus X. He created a DVD. Chris has detailed images of HVX infected plants, discussed ways to prevent the spread, and gave advice about keeping HVX out of the garden. When it came to the nursery, Hallson Garden had a great reputation for selling virus-free hostas. Chris moderated a popular online hosta forum, which he founded in 2001. He also moderated a perennials, an HVX, and a specialty plants forum. Questions with photos were submitted, and Chris answered. He was very knowledgeable, or still is knowledgeable, and often his comments were extensive. Chris now resides over in Ireland, and we've asked him to have a class today on hosta virus X for us. So, welcome.
Well, thanks a lot, guys, for having me. Like Ed mentioned, I ran a hosta nursery, actually, Hallson Gardens, for 25 years. And for me, I think I saw my first hosta virus X infected plant in the year 2000. So hard to believe, 21 years ago. And a lot of people still think that they think, wow, this is something brand new. It's never been around. Well, it was even around before I ever had a chance to see it in 2000, unfortunately. And at the time, I didn't know what it was, but I just knew that it looked like a diseased plant. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't have that in my nursery. Well, about a year later, somebody else stopped by and they had another one. And they said, hey, look at this great plant. I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure that's a disease. So then, a year after that, somebody else said, hey, can you help me to introduce and register this cool sport of gold standard? I'm like, that absolutely is not a sport. And that's when I found out exactly that it was a virus, like my gut was telling me. And I found out it was hosta virus X. So today I'm going to show you a bunch of slides, and I'm going to switch over to my slideshows here and talk to you a little bit more. The key here is to educate and to make sure that you guys know what hosta virus X looks like. And I don't want to scare you, and I definitely don't want to distract you from growing hostas, enjoying hostas, because that's, we all have a passion. That's what brings us all together. I still have that passion, even though I don't have the nursery anymore. I brought 500 and some hostas across the pond over to Ireland with me. And so, yes, I'm still into hostas. And, even though HVX really did affect me, and especially having a nursery and having to trash thousands of plants and start over, start fresh, get new sources, new suppliers, and really just do a reboot. I had to give money back to people. I guess I didn't have to, but that's what I chose to do. And, I really worked hard to eliminate it. And you know what? The plants got better. I instituted quarantines and grew the hostas longer. But, I had a better product, and people had, better understanding through education and everything about what hosta virus X was. So I'm not here to scare you off by any means, all right? We still love hostas. But it is important that you know what this is. Hosta virus X does exist. It can spread, and it's incurable. There really aren't cures in the garden for viruses. It is possible that if you have a very rare plant and you want to propagate it, and there's no way to get another source of it, there are things like with tissue culturing, and I'm not talking about the mass-produced tissue culturing. I'm talking about tissue culturing where they actually take a plant, put it in a culture, and they try to propagate ahead of the virus spreading through the plant. And that's a repeated process over and over and over again of growing and testing and trying to get ahead. So it is possible to get virus kind of grown out of a plant, but that's not in the garden. There's not going to be a cure. I want to show you for sure what the symptoms are, because it's through recognizing those virus symptoms that you're going to identify it the most often in your garden or in other nurseries when you go into shop and stuff. And then I'll talk about preventing the spread. All right. So I just want to give you as much information as I can in an hour here. And really, why should we even care about hosta virus? insects, yes. You know, it permanently infects the plant. When we grow hostas, we grow them for the leaves and what they look like. Now, these virus symptoms are expressed in the leaves. They can spread to a lot of different hostas in the garden if kept, unchecked. So you end up with this ugly appearance, and pretty soon everything would have this homogeneous, blotchy, deformed, and just all kind of look like crap. Okay, and we don't want to do that. So like other viruses, we know that this can spread in the garden, it can spread in the nursery, and this has impacted a lot of different nurseries, especially those that specialize in hostas. We see it out there all the time, and a lot of the specialty ones know about it, but a lot of times they may not even recognize all of the various symptoms. HVX spread a lot at the wholesale level, especially the Dutch imports, Dutch exports and stuff. HVX could show up in tissue culture if they're not careful. And I got tissue culture plants from Shady Oaks one time that actually were HVX infected. And it was probably a case of the hosta, they said, nope, it was tested a couple of times before it went into culture. But you know what? That may have been a fresh infection of that plant. Maybe it was such a low concentration that it didn't show up, but it was there. And like I mentioned before, HVX is incurable, and there are no hostas that are immune to HVX. So it's important to know about this whole thing. So a lot of times people say, where the heck did this come from? Now, some of the earliest examples of HVX plants were of Japanese origin, and they were oftentimes cultivars in nurseries. They were given names. In fact, in the 80s, there were people talking about it. In the 90s, there were tons of plants that people thought were sports, and they registered and introduced them. And these were HVX infected plants. Now, it was in 1996 that Dr. Ben Lockhart at the University of Minnesota identified that this was a Potex virus. That was the type of virus that it was. And that's how it got the X designation, hostavirus X for Potex. And he developed some test screening for it, and he also helped to develop the immunostrip assay that Agdia sells that they're going to talk about in the next hour. So I mentioned there were some named and registered for HVX, and you have blue freckles, which is Bertram Parkey's gold. Eternal Father was an infected sunflower registered in '99. If you go through these older registrations, you're going to almost find these things regularly because they talk about unique, mottled, blotchy, whatever, like leopard frog, an infected little aurora that was registered in 2000. So it really got to the point where the registrations got filled with these things. So unfortunately, a lot of times people just didn't even know. They thought, wow, cool sport, And another one here, breakdance. That one was in 2003 where that's really what got me. I kept trying to tell people on our forums online, that's not a sport, that's a virus. And they're like, no, I've had it for a few years. It hasn't spread to anything else. It's like, well, you don't know that without testing everything else. And people were dividing it, sharing it, and that's an infected fan dance. So unfortunately, these things, people thought they were cool. They were going to spread them all around. Now, Dr. Lockhart, in 2008 to about 2012, he did more research for the AHS, and they were some basic questions that they wanted to ask. Now, he did a lot of research prior to this as well. Now, in this particular batch of research, he just asked some basic questions. Can HVX be transmitted during normal cultivation? How can it be transmitted? Those sort of questions were asked. Now, HVX really was found to most easily transmit via tools, but it was also interesting that he found out that plants could catch HVX from old plant debris left in the soil. And so that was sort of the shocker, was that, hosta roots in the soil that were infected could infect new hostas that were planted in the same spot or planted in the same potting soil. So that was kind of a crazy thing. Now, he didn't have much luck transmitting by just handling with your hands. But I can tell you in my nursery, when I was dealing with HVX infected batches in 05, 06, we would pot up like 500 hostas, and then later find out that some of those batches were infected. But then we also were potting throughout the whole day, and one or two plants in the next 100 batch, and one or two plants in the next 100 batch, even though they were clean batches, sometimes from tissue culture, sometimes from good growers that never had HVX. Well, that meant that it was our hands that were doing it. So it's so important then that we know how this moves. Also, now, he also wanted to know, how long can HVX survive on surfaces and on tools. And he found that HVX remained infective on tools for up to 3 weeks. That meant dried plant sap and HVX within that plant sap. It's gone into a completely inactive state because it can't replicate, because there really is no living plant material anymore, and it could survive for 3 weeks. That means it's a really robust virus. I mean, this stuff is just amazing how it can survive sort of on its own in just dried up old plant sap. And that's part of the problem why we have the idea of root debris in the soil is sort of a twofold problem. First of all, root debris from hosta, it takes forever to break down. You can have a hosta where the crown has been eaten by voles or has rotted out in a pot, and I've dumped it out the next summer only to see new roots coiling around in the bottom of that pot. It's like, these phantom roots that have no head anymore, and it's just, they're growing on their own. So it takes a long time for the roots to sort of stop and shut down their growth, and then it takes a long time for the root to actually die off on its own. So then you have a virus that's really robust without an active living host sort of thing. So it's that kind combined together that they say you really shouldn't replant a hosta in the same spot unless you completely got rid of all the old soil, all the old root debris. But that's kind of an issue when you're digging up an HVX hosta in the garden, is that, we tend to crowd things a bit. It's going to be really hard to get all of the root material. So, you're kind of playing with fire there when you're talking about trying to get every last bit. So it's better to just pop out the hosta and then not plant a hosta there. And they say maybe it could be years. We don't really know that. Now, if HVX remains infective on tools, what's the best way to decontaminate those tools? So Dr. Lockhart did several different tests using things as simple as dishwashing detergent, household bleach, and he found that it didn't really matter. Soap and water worked pretty much, but you had to scrub those tools. You couldn't just dip your tool in bleach. That didn't kill the virus. You had to scrub it. You had to get rid of all the plant sap. And for me, I really like to use Lysol wipes, Clorox wipes, which is the same ingredient as the Lysol wipes. And I often used, in the nursery, I use something called a Santa Claus wipe that I would order online. Get a big tub. Now that has two things in it. It has Lysol and it has rubbing alcohol in it. So the Lysol helps to really clean and the rubbing alcohol helps it to dry out faster. But I always had disinfecting wipes in my pocket. And whenever I was cutting in with scissors or anything like that, or knives, if I was dividing, I always had extra clean knives around to make sure they were really clean when dividing. So you got to remember, it's not enough to just dip in a solution. You have to scrub. Now, there was a couple other things in the study that he did. He was wondering about concentration dependencies, and it didn't matter whether it was a low concentration of HVX or a high concentration of HVX he's working with. It spread pretty easily. He actually worked with 15 different isolates. He had 15 different plants that he had HVX from, and there were a couple of different strains in there. In fact, we shipped him a plant of Big Daddy, and he realized when he got it that it was a different strain, and he made sure that that was incorporated with his testing. Now, he did find, however, that it didn't matter on the concentration, but it depended on the season. He found that there was a seasonal dependence. So spring planting and spring wounding, when the plants were very actively growing, they caught HVX a lot easier. Later in the season, especially post-flowering, when the plants are going dormant more, had a hard time infecting plants that way. In fact, he even got to the point where he believed that when a plant was dormant, it didn't absorb HVX because there was no sap really flowing. So now, it's hard to say definitively, but he definitely noted that seasonal dependence. And that could explain why early on it was thought that maybe the Seboldianas were immune, although it's been found now they're not. We found plenty of examples of Seboldiana types of Francis Williams and Love Pat and Big Daddy and stuff that had HVX and tested positive for HVX, but it's more that seasonal component that did it, where the Seboldiana types have a very short window in the spring. They send up leaves, boom. They flower, boom. Then they're done. They shut down. You ever get a deer come in and eat down elegans? It doesn't grow no new leaves that year. It's going to grow leaves the following year because it goes into that shutdown period. So that's why some hostas may be easier to infect at any time of the year. A golden tiara, for example, is going to keep growing. It's going to flower twice. Your twist lime and lemon lime, they flower multiple times in the year. So those guys don't really ever shut down their growth, and they're going to catch it pretty easily any time of year. All right. So that's just one of the things to keep in mind, is that seasonal dependence. And so that's how he wanted to know, are there any HVX resistant hostas? No, there really aren't. I mentioned that there aren't any varieties that are resistant to HVX. There is an issue with some are resistant to showing symptoms. So there are some hostas that can be asymptomatic carriers. Those hostas can include Francie, Patriot, Minuteman, Revolution. You kind of see the family resemblance, but also then you've got things like Halcyon, First Frost, El Nino. These guys can be infected for years and not show symptoms. I had a Halcyon that I isolated off on its own for several years behind the shed. That dang thing tested positive early on, repeatedly tested positive. I never saw symptoms. After 5 years, I let it go. I cut it loose. I dug it up and threw it away. So, that's the problem, is that sometimes plants can get infected without really showing things. So really, what's the best way for us to test? Really, now in a nursery or in your home setting, the best way is going to be the test strips that Aggia sells. Like I mentioned, there's another presentation that talks about that. The test strips are really easy to use. If you're a nursery owner, a grower that grows hostas, especially if you specialize in hostas, you really should have the test strips on hand. I had them and I still have some now today. In fact, I had a weird looking hosta the other day. I went ahead and I tested it. It tested negative, and that just kind of helped me confirm that it was a weird spring, because we have tons of freezes here as well. So, it's great to have those test strips. It can cost $5 to $10 a strip. So, maybe they're expensive for the home gardener, but if you're a nursery owner, you better have them. So now I'm going to go through some of the different symptoms. And now we've got 4 different hostas here that really have like 3 different looks. Okay. You've got this sort of radiating pattern that we often will call ink bleed. So if you ever hear of anybody saying it has ink bleed, that's where you imagine that ink was poured down the vein and radiated out from the vein. It's here, and then it's up here as well. And then you're also going to be, I talk about collapsing tissue, and I'm going to show you a lot of that. Now, if you ever wonder why does HVX express along the vein like that, well, that's where the sap flows. HVX will draw up into the leaf along the vein, and then it radiates out because it will first infect the cell. It'll get in and start to build up concentration within a cell. When the concentration gets high enough, basically when that cell has run out of nutrients to keep HVX going, HVX destroys the cell wall, it gets into the next cell, and then it gets into the next cell. And so that's how it ends up sort of radiating out from the vein. It sort of starts on the vein and then works its way out. The collapsing tissue happens when so many cell walls break down that the leaf loses its overall structure, and it literally collapses so that it becomes a thinner, but also sometimes thicker leaf. So here's 4 different looks. And now in the yellow hostas, it was really the most noticeable, easiest to diagnose, especially early on when we knew almost nothing about this. 2003, 2004, we were seeing gold standard all the time. And you could go into almost any nursery, and there was gold standard with HVX again and again and again. And I was always telling people, we got to be careful. Gold standard has it. Striptease is next. Well, and Striptease got it. And then we're like, well, now what's next? And now, unfortunately, I've seen it in snake eyes as well. So, it's the kind of thing where these things, they have a tendency to be in the family almost, showing symptoms. But the yellow hostas are going to show more of that dark green ink bleed. Or in the case here of Birchwood Parkey's Gold, you've got this blue-green modeling, and this tissue is collapsing a little bit. And then in the next one, this is Sun Power. And again, you're seeing this ink bleed. Now, this is sort of a low early on. It's not a real bad example of Sun Power because it ends up, it's just not as defined. This is really bad infection on Gold Edger. And then you have August Moon. That doesn't really show so much your ink bleeding, a little bit here, other than it's just great big splotches on August Moon. Maui Buttercup's showing really serious infection. You've got along the veins here is the ink bleed, and over here it's really bad. The concentration might be a little higher on this side of the plant than on that side of the plant, but just because you don't see symptoms, it doesn't mean that it's not there. It just might not be as much has spread to that side of the hosta yet. And then here's Rainforest Sunrise, very early on infection in Rainforest Sunrise. Gold Standard. Now this is Lady Guinevere showing some collapsing tissue, as well as like I said, it's following the vein here. The normal color should be here, and you've got the discoloration on the vein. This is really early symptoms on Guacamole, and this tested positive almost was probably a case in my nursery where I probably saw the positive test before I saw the symptom. And this is Catherine Lewis, also tested positive, and there's the symptoms. So this is June, really showing vivid symptoms of the ink bleed along the vein. I had someone come in my nursery several years ago. They asked for June. Took them over, showed them June. They said, that's not June. My neighbor has a June with these beautiful blue stripes down it. And I was like, no, sorry, that's an infected June. And I went and got, copies of the presentation and showed them. It's like, this is what happens with HVX. And this is Zounds. And again, this is probably really early on, low concentration, just starting to express symptoms. This is a strip tease, and you can just kind of see blotches and some collapsing tissue. Here's ink bleed over here, and this is a close-up to show you better of that. And the other thing that you can see sometimes, you see these green spots and dots. That can also be another symptom, and we see that a lot in things like sum and substance. Now here's, again, Gypsy Rose showing some, and then here is a snake eyes. Now, unfortunately, snake eyes, it was introduced by a guy in Michigan that beautiful, beautiful sport of striptease. Now, it was propagated in the Netherlands, and the Dutch imports have been coming in for a few years into the States. And you know what? This is your collapsing tissue here. I might say, that could just be normal color change as striptease or snake eyes goes from yellow, from green to yellow. And over here, maybe a little bit, but then you start to see more of this, and this is your collapsing tissue, and definitely here is collapsing tissue. So hopefully you can see my cursor there. But yeah, that's the sort of thing. Now, over here, I see a little bit of crinkling, and honestly, that could be a little frost damage. That might not be the HVX right there. It's hard to tell, but then when you see this, yep, for sure, it's HVX. Now, here's another case. This is a hosta where a lot of people thought the Seboldianas were immune. They are not. This is Francis Williams. You can see the ink bleed over here. Hopefully you guys can see my cursor there on the screen. So the other thing you're seeing here, though, is the spring burn, or what they're calling edema now, which is what happens to the gold tissue on Seboldianas, such as golden sunburst or Francis Williams. When the spring weather is, it's above freezing, but below 40 degrees, these guys get cold damage. It's not specifically frost damage, but they can get cold damage when that occurs, especially when it's kind of dry, and that will turn brown later on. So people will sometimes see just this and think, oh no, my Francis William has HVX. No, that's the spring burn or edema, and this over here is what unfortunately expressed itself. So that's the ink bleed on Francis Williams. Here's an infected tattoo that actually got registered in, what was that one? Was that was leopard frog, actually, that this was called when it was registered, an infected tattoo. And this is American Dream. This is showing your ink bleed on the veins as well as collapsing tissue. Shade Fanfare showing collapsing tissue in here. So hopefully you can see all that good on the screens. Now, here's your radiating out on Fan Dance. That was called Break Dance. And here's a very early infection on Sum and Substance. You can barely see this down here, but that's a little bit of the ink bleed. You can also see some dots. Now, this was an interesting case. This was in 2004 at my nursery. I brought in 100 Sum and Substance. They cost like 75 cents each. They were 3 to 5 eye plants. They were just gorgeous. Then they came out, and I saw this. So I sent samples out to Dr. Lockhart in 2004. He tested them positive HVX. But then I got wondering, what about the other like 95 hostas in there or so that weren't showing any symptoms? So I sent him samples. And he goes, well, they're kind of negative. I'm like, what do you mean kind of negative? And he goes, well, normally at such a low concentration, I would say that it's not positive. And he goes, but it is there. And so it was a kind of thing where it was just triggering a little bit in the ELISA testing. And so he then looked at it under the electron microscope and he saw virus particles. So he basically, that was the learning moment, that just because you don't see symptoms within a batch, if you got 5 or 6 hostas in a batch that have HVX, you can kind of bet, especially if it's a Dutch import, the rest of them are infected as well. So throw them out, get rid of all of them, try to get my money back, even though what it was at 75 cents, I was out a lot more in potting soil and time, that's for sure. But Sum and Substance does get a lot worse. You see a lot of these weird spots to go along with your ink bleed along there, and it just can get worse. I mean, this is just disgusting, but this was at, somebody shared this picture with me. They said they saw it in Indianapolis Flower Show, and that the landscaper said it was a new variety of hostavirus X. Well, no, it's just an infected hostavirus X. So now green and blue hostas can sometimes have similar patterns, but then again, sometimes you see something totally different. And this is golden tiara. Now, I've seen a lot of these out in gardens. I see pictures pop up on the internet. People don't even realize it's HVX. You don't see you don't see so much of the mottling. You don't see the ink bleed. You don't see the collapsing tissue, but what you do see, it's almost like somebody took sandpaper, to the leaves. It's just a dull finish. It doesn't have that distinct color that really a tiara should have. The same thing in diamond tiara. You should have a much darker green, but now here you're seeing a lighter discoloration. Now, this is along the vein where it's radiating out. So you can kind of see it there, but it's just not quite as prominent as some of them. And this is Veronica Lake showing, interestingly enough, instead of dark green color, it's showing this light cream color. But again, radiating out from the veins. And in this case, this, instead of being collapsed, this bit was actually raised up like warts. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. This is Pacific Blue Edger radiating out from the vein. And again, you got the lighter discoloration. This is Regal Splendor. I'm sorry, this is not a pretty looking plant. I don't see why anybody would want to ever grow this in their garden when it looks like that. This is Blue Angel, showing some very light discoloration on the vein. Abaquad Drinking Gourd, showing this radiating out from the vein. You can see this, how it's coming out in this lighter color. This is Love Pat. Was just shared with me recently. Your Love Pat should be more blue, and for some reason with the symptoms, it doesn't have as much of a waxy coating, but it does have also that sunken pattern to it. It's a distortion, not a corrugation. If this was normal corrugation, it would be even across the whole plant, but this is just bizarre the way that happens. And here's one that even myself was a little bit surprised by. Somebody brought this to my nursery. They had just purchased it at a plant sale, and they said, you know what, I think it's mislabeled. And I jokingly said to him when I went walking over to their trunk to take a look at it, I said, every time somebody says, can you identify this hosta? I usually say, yeah, it's hosta blah, 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 and it's infected with hosta virus X, ha, ha, ha. He opened up the trunk, and I looked at that, and I said, you know what, I think we need to test that because I think it might be hosta virus X. So see, this is all chewed out here. I actually took leaf sample out of there to test it, and it did test positive. But would you normally think just these little white dots would be virus X? It's just the plant has no frost damage and no other damage, and it was really on just a few of the leaves, but they were also a couple of the newest leaves. So I saw that, and I'm like, you know what? We need to take another look. We need to test that. So sometimes, it can fool me. I wasn't like, oh, for sure it is, but I was like, I think it might be. And it did. It was just crazy that turned out to be. Here's another look that was HVX. This is on a plant called Venucosa. And this is the kind of thing where it's almost a translucent modeling through there. And now this one is Mountain Snow. And again, we see these spots and dashes, but then you have this discoloration on the vein, and the discoloration radiates from the vein. And this is Abbey, which is showing this, again, this darker green sort of radiating to the yellow. This probably should be in my yellow slides because it's on the yellow portion of the tissue. So Sweet isn't showing any real color change, not distinctly. A little bit of light colors in there, but again, you've got this distortion, bubbling sort of the leaves. And this is one that's definitely bad. Holly's Honey, with a ton of HVX in that plant. You almost don't recognize that it's a hosta leaf at that point. Niagara Falls also showing this distortion without color change. Ventricosa, distortion without color change, but it does follow the veins. That's the one thing, that it follows the veins and it goes all the way in. I'm going to go back a slide as well, how this is following the veins, and it wraps right around here all the way to the base. If this was frost damage, it would be confined to a certain portion of the leaf, or it would be confined to only one outer leaf and the rest would all be good. Now, this has no other damage, no yellow edges, and it goes all the way right into this newly opening leaf. So, you can kind of tell that's not frost damage. And this is Lakeside Black Satin. You have these discoloration, distortion. This did also get stepped on in the spring, I'm certain, but you've got that all the way in every single leaf. And this is a brand new leaf. So again, that's not frost damage. If I saw that on one leaf early on in the year, I'd say, I don't know, maybe it is. But then you see a brand new leaf come out and you're like, oh no, that's virus X. And this is Lederhosen. Unfortunately, this also ends up It sort of follows along the veins, that distortion there. Audra Wilson showing collapsing tissue in the green as well as the white. And I see Night Before Christmas show the collapsing in the white like that too. And again, here's collapsing tissue on the dark green portion of Audra Wilson. Here's distortion on Phantom. Should look like this, not like that. Like same thing here, you got this weird distortion. And people really thought when they saw this, they thought, wow, is that ever a cool sport? And I was like, no, that's got to be virus X. And then the person actually had it tested. So they sent out and got it tested and confirmed. Now, this side probably would have had a positive test as well. It just doesn't show the symptoms quite yet. But yeah, that's a sad case of Montana Oreo marginata. Twilight showing discoloration on the vein here and distortion as well. And then Geisha is showing kind of a pattern similar to the Golden Tiara, like somebody took sandpaper to it. You've got, distortion, discoloration. It's kind of a mess, unfortunately. And here's Night Before Christmas. It might have a little bit of color change in the white here. And boy, if that was in your garden, wouldn't you miss those spots? Really hard to see those few spots in here. But the thing to remember, it sort of follows the vein. And that's, another sign that could be HVX. And here's discoloration modeling on Ginkgo Craig, modeling on Stiletto, modeling on Longfellow. On this Longfellow, I did get in tissue culture. They were tissue culture plants shipped to me, and they were all tested positive for virus X. And that was the kind of thing where I saw the symptoms, got the test kit, got the sample in. I knew within, minutes, really, that it was virus infected. So that can happen. This is summer fragrance. You have distortion along the veins, and then you have a lighter discoloration radiating from the veins. This is wide brim, not the best photograph, but it shows you that along the veins, it's the wrong color. And then wide brim is a much older plant with a higher concentration. You see this kind of distortion here, and not only the green part, but you see there's this weird distortion in the cream part as well on wide brim. This is Royal Standard showing lighter discoloration, no real tissue collapse, but you can see light shining through it. So it's like the leaf has lost its substance entirely and the light shines through. And that is one thing that if I would sometimes have really trouble seeing if there was a discoloration or a modeling, I would hold it up to the light. And whenever people would bring me leaves and say, Chris, do you think this is virus X? First thing I ever did was take that and I would hold it up to a light source and look through it, because frost and environmental damage is going to be on the surfaces and not through the leaf. If you have a leaf that's frost damaged and you hold it to the light, it all shows the same color through and through. When you have a virus X infected plant, you're going to see a different color on the symptom parts. So I would often hold it up to the light. And here's alba marginata losing its alba margin. And here's El Nino, really hard to see, but there is this distortion along the veins. You can see it down here, and you can see it all in here. And so El Nino and Halcyon, I mentioned before, first frost, rarely do they show symptoms really defined. It takes a long time, high concentration of infection. So you could have a Halcyon in the garden for years and may never see symptoms. Same thing here, this is frosted dimples. Without doing a positive test, I was just getting ready to start putting these back into production and dividing them in my nursery. And I looked and I'm like, all right, why did I get a positive test? Then I went looking for the symptoms. Here's symptoms here as well, and maybe a little bit here. So now I'll talk a little bit about symptoms that aren't caused by host virus X, and I'll try to show you some things. One of the things to remember is that if you see browning and burning spots, virus X doesn't do that. You gotta remember, virus X doesn't kill the plants, and it makes them look ugly. A lot of times it doesn't even really change their habit of growth. I mean, they may still grow well. If you've got a virus X plant that isn't growing well, it might not have grown well even if it wasn't infected. But, the virus doesn't want to kill the plant or slow it down. It wants that plant to just keep going and keep feeding it, So sunken and burn spots you're going to see from chemical damage or translucent brown patches on things like Francis Williams and stuff. Those aren't it. Molly Buttercups is another one that can sometimes get that spring burning from the cold temperatures. A lot of times with drought, you're going to see brown on the tips and things. So fungal spots. Now, I think a lot of times, a lot of the early pictures online of virus X infected hostas were older leaves that had dried out in the laboratory already a bit. So they took a picture and people go, wow, look at the brown edges. But that wasn't it. It was something else in the leaf that was the symptom. And frost damage in the spring is probably a big one. Now, this is Lancifolia that, you see those spots and you think, could that be something weird? But this plant had been snowed on. It didn't actually get cold enough to freeze, but it was covered with snow. And then after the snow melted, I was left with these dots. And I could run my fingernail across it and feel that it was surface damage. So that's not virus X. This is chemical salt damage, probably something like water soluble that evaporated and left these spots. And this is golden sunburst. Like I said, this is yellow version of Francis Williams. You're going to see this, it's from cold settling into the veins. And honestly, I have seen cases of frost freeze where the frost settles into the veins and you get that almost ink bleed look. And the difference is that the ink bleed usually disappears when the hosta leaf dries out, and then it rains on it and it gets wet again and you see it again. So that's physical damage that can be, it's most likely later it's going to be a fungal issue or a bacterial issue in those spots. And even this spring, I had one, like I mentioned, I tested one that I was like, hey, that's kind of bizarre. Well, it was frost damage, and now that it's July, those leaves are all burned up along the vein. But it sure looked like it. It settled into the oldest leaves, and the new leaves are fine. So that's just one thing. Yes, frost damage can mimic this, unfortunately, but look at the new leaves after that and then keep an eye on it if you're not sure. Same thing here. These were eyes that were getting ready to come up, and then it got frosted. And sure enough, it looks weird. It's got all the distortion and the color change and everything, but the leaf was having trouble unfurling. And so after that, the first set of outer leaves was done. The rest of them popped out and they were fine. So that's just the other thing, and we want to look at that. And here's another case. It was a case of spotting, but then you get a secondary fungal infection to the frost damage. Again, another case here of frost damage. There's a couple of things. I've got some browning here. I've got a little tear here that's looking kind of weird. But otherwise, you look at that and you think, well, that looks just like those other pictures, doesn't it? But when I flip over and look at the back of the leaf, and a lot of times I'll tell people, look at the back of the leaf. Tell me, what does that look like? And then when I flip it over, I see this bubbling. You get a separation of the tissue layers from the frost. And that can then lead to distortion on the front as it's trying to grow. So you've got some bits are growing and some bits are not growing. Some of it has died. And a lot of times you see that where that surface damage has occurred. The other thing is that if I was to hold this up to light, I'm sure we would see all one color through it. But you got a few things, this could be damage otherwise, but it's that bubbling on the back. So if you have just one older leaf on the plant, the newer leaves look okay, and then you flip over that leaf, you might see some bubbling where the cold has made the tissue separate from the different layers. Here's another one where people a lot of times will think, oh my God, that looks like that radiating from the veins. But I'll say this is a nutrient issue. The hosta is growing so fast that it just hasn't greened up yet. A lot of times in the summer, you'll get these huge downpours, and all of a sudden this rapid fire growth occurs. Your nutrients are flowing along the veins, and they're just starting to get out into the leaf to help it green up. So the leaves are just starting to green up. But whenever I see this, where people say, is this or isn't it? The correct color should be this darker green. If the correct color is on the vein, this vein is dark green. So there's nothing weird going on with the vein itself. And that's kind of when I know. With Virus X, it's a yellow plant that has a green vein, or it's a green plant that has a lighter vein. So that's the sort of thing that you're going to see these nutrient issues. But this is not it's really not even a plant problem. It's just a fast growing plant that hasn't totally greened up. These leaves are popping out fast. So you've got the correct color on the vein and the lighter color in between, and it's relatively even and throughout the whole plant. Color changes, natural color changes can occur, or damage. There's a little bit of damage over here that caused this not to color up correctly. This is moonlight, where your center goes from green to yellow, and you get some of this weird where it's just not completely greening up totally. Same thing here. It's just, it was green and it's turning yellow. Paul's Glory can do that sometimes. This was probably a Paul's Glory that got some frost damage, and then the plant wasn't coloring up quite the way it should. You should be looking more like this. So it's, again, the normal color on the vein, and then that dark green left over. And this was a case of a plant where there was concern that it was HVX, but that it really is frost damage. You can tell from the brown on the edges. These leaves probably just had trouble unfurling in the spring, but the new leaves look clean and look fine. So that's another case. But the brown edges are kind of, to me, say, no, there's something else going on there. most likely frost damage. Also, you'll sometimes get little speckles and streaks. You got Revolution that's supposed to speckle. You got Loyalist that sometimes speckles. This is June Spirit, and I've seen it on Justine. You sometimes get normal speckling. Another issue is like with plants like Blue Ivory. This is Great Escape. Some of those guys that are like the white edged plants, they get misted during stressed times. It can be really hot or dry, and we see this come out a lot of times where it gets misted. Sometimes it's a normal look on things like Elegant Fog, Ghost Spirit, where you get the misting, or Whirlwind that goes through color changes and also mists. So those are normal color changes. Undulata, when it's stressed out, same thing. You're going to get a lot of this misting in there. It might be hard to see HVX on an undulata, but this happens so often that it's usually okay just to say, no, it's normal, don't worry about it. So some additional symptoms of hostas: discoloration, like I mentioned, it runs through the leaf, so a lot of times I'll hold it up to a light source. It also sometimes seemed to be when I was growing, unfortunately growing enough of them, I seemed to see HVX symptoms more in the cooler weather. I would see leaves come out in the summertime when it was really hot that didn't show symptoms, and then it would cool off and I get another leaf that comes out and shows it. So it seemed to be sort of a case where cooler weather I saw more symptoms. You also got to remember that the concentration can vary from eye to eye. So you might see it in one side of an eye, not the other. The concentration can be variable throughout the whole plant. So it may take longer for it to really express throughout a whole plant. It might even take a whole season, okay? So how does it spread? I mentioned this already. Mostly it's mechanically spread, so mostly a human spread virus. We're always touching and cutting and doing everything and dividing, moving things around. The more we cut into leaves, the more we divide, the more we dig up and move, the more the chance that you could do it if you don't disinfect your tool. So it doesn't matter, but just about any damage when digging, weeding, planting, string trimmers, lawnmowers coming by, you might run over an infected plant, and the next thing you know, the rest of the hostas down that road with the lawnmower are infected. And HVX could even do by simple handling. So that's how it does spread. Unfortunately, in the wholesale trade, and especially from the Dutch exports, the main reason it seemed that they spread by the Dutch plants was that it was a agriculture department requirement to remove all soil so there would be no soil-borne nematodes shipped with the hostas. That meant going into power washing machines that would use the hosta water would be recycled in order to save on water, and multiple batches would be cleaned, which really strips off that outer layer of root material, and then that root material water is then power washing the next batch. So once you get a batch in a day, it's pretty good chance that almost everything that was washed that day ends up with virus. And they also will sometimes, use mechanical machines to weed and to harvest. So a lot of this handling and stuff can cause the spread. The other issue is that they would harvest all the hostas in the field and replant new hostas in the field. So once you've got a field that's full of HVX, we know that any root debris left over is going to keep moving it. And then if 10% of the new hostas have HVX, once they hit the power washing machines again, now they all have it. So it seemed to be just a perfect storm of spreading. And that's why we're still seeing things from the Dutch come in, like snake eyes coming in. There's a lot of different plants. And, I watch Facebook, and I'm on Facebook, and I try to answer questions and stuff. And I see more and more what I know are Dutch produced plants, new plants that are now coming from that, and then they show it. So unfortunately that happens. Now, some ways that it might spread, we're not 100% certain, but maybe deer can spread it, maybe rabbits and groundhogs and things like that. As far as voles go, they might spread it, but voles tend to be more active in the wintertime. Remember, there's that seasonal dependence. If the vole activity is mostly in the winter and they're nibbling on different hostas, they might do more damage to the hostas than HVX. But, we don't know if these things spread it. No studies have really been done, but it is theoretically possible that a deer could come in, mow down the whole garden, and then that next thing you know, they've all sort of been, possibly exposed to HVX. So that's one of the reasons why we really shouldn't keep HVX in the garden. So some ways that it shouldn't spread, a lot of people think, well, it's got to be the slugs. It's got to be the slugs. But when slugs are eating, their saliva is breaking down plant proteins, and HVX is really a type of protein. So HVX should be broken down with the plant and digested long before the slugs get to the next variety. They're going to have a feast, but they're not going to be moving around like a deer might. HVX also doesn't spread by insects. It's also very unlikely that it's being spread by honeybees or anything that are collecting pollen, or by hummingbirds that are, drinking nectar. These just really aren't ways that we would expect it. There also doesn't seem to be a lot of HVX activity up the flower stalks. So cutting scapes is one of those things that may not spread as much, but still clean those tools. Some people say that it spreads by rain, but no, you got to have one heck of a rainstorm to really be damaging the plants. So now I want to tell you, what do we do to prevent this? Because there is no cure. There's not going to be a cure, all right? Plant viruses have been around for ages, long before HVX. There are plant viruses that affect much more important crops throughout the world, that if we could cure those viruses, we would be doing it already. The only way to really get rid of the virus plant is to destroy the plant itself, all right? That's going to be our number one goal. We don't want to keep infected plants in the nursery. We don't want to keep infected plants in the landscape. We want to adopt a zero tolerance policy, and then educate, all right? You also want to avoid unnecessary contact with your hostas. I got to tell you, we all dig, divide, we move. I was moving and potting some hostas the other day, and it's the kind of thing where we're always touching it. But you know what? Avoid too much unnecessary. If you go out there and you're cleaning and trimming, have a disinfecting wipe in your pocket. Have that with you. Be cleaning your scissors, be cleaning your tools, before and after and stuff. Another way that I try to avoid too much unnecessary cutting is to use digging forks when I dig. So I use digging forks in the garden, and you're prying out the hosta rather than cutting out the hosta. So that's another way that you're not cutting as much, all right? And then after you avoid all this unnecessary activity, and if you do, oh, by the way, in avoiding cutting down your hostas in the fall, wait till they've had a frost. Wait till they're no longer completely green in celery stalk, okay? Because that way you're not cutting live plants, you're cutting dormant plants. You're going to reduce the spread by cutting down later in the fall. And please don't mow them down with the lawnmower. I just worry about spreading all kinds of diseases, whether it's virus, fungus, or whatever. You use some trimmers and clean the trimmers and cut them down. And if you wait until the winter time and it's all mush, you might be able to just rake it up and not even have to worry about some of that other stuff. So, wait until later in the year to cut down your hostas. And then when you are touching things, disinfect. Wash your hands, wash your pruners, your shovels, scrub them, and let them dry. Okay, so that's your best bet. These are your prevention measures. Get rid of HVX plants to begin with, avoid the unnecessary cutting, wait until the fall to cut them down, and disinfect them. Now, how do you eliminate those plants? Really, the only way is to dig them up. And with infectious material, you should throw it in the trash. They recommend 2 black bags. But you know what? Some of these hostas can get big, and they can get heavy. So what I would do is take a larger clump, go out to the sunny lawn, and then rinse off the dirt. And then I would take that hosta, and because I was throwing away and destroying thousands of plants, we built tables that we dried the roots on, and that way it would dry out on the tables, and then I would have a light, carcass that I could then throw in the black trash bags. So, you could put it out in the driveway. That soil, don't let that soil spread out to your hosta gardens. You can't compost them because then you could have root debris in your compost. So, I've heard some people like to burn them, and I suppose that's fine. You can burn them up if you can do that in your yard, but really throw them away. When you're digging up those hostas, use spading forks and dig them out in the fall. There's that seasonal component that it doesn't spread as well when the plants are not actively growing. So dig in the fall. So kind of mark the location, mark the plant that you want to dig up, and then do it in the fall. Get some forks, pop it out. If you've given your hostas enough room, you could dig it out with a shovel and you don't have to worry about cutting into neighboring roots. But if you garden like most of us, our hostas touch each other. If you can remember in a new garden to give your hostas some social distance, okay, and disinfect afterwards, then that's fine. But if you garden like the rest of us, we're short of space and there's far too many hostas to collect to keep them far apart, okay? Now, some people do report spraying with herbicides. I've inadvertently sprayed hostas with herbicide and intentionally tried with Roundup to kill hostas, and I really wasn't successful. I top killed, and with one, it took a year before it came back. and the other popped back up later in the season. So, I don't see any real benefit to that. There's no guarantee that it will kill into the roots. And even if those roots are starting to die, you're still left with roots. So I don't see that extra step as really being anything helpful, spraying it with Roundup at all. Really just pop it out in the fall. Okay. Otherwise, repeat applications, and you're not even sure if it's done anything new or different. All right. But remember, watch those tools and stuff. So clean the tools. It doesn't matter what you clean with. Some people swear by using the bleach. I didn't like using bleach because, when you mix up bleach, it's only going to last a day before the bleach evaporates. So I did use Lysol all the time, or I would use rubbing alcohol. Especially when I was washing off, I would have Lysol wipes, but I also had alcohol wipes. I mean, it was a whole process of me cleaning all the time. But I love the disinfectant wipes. They have ammonium chloride in them. And then I did buy Santa Claus wipes that had both the ammonium chloride, which was Lysol and alcohol. Those are great things to do. It doesn't matter what you use, though. Remember to scrub. Okay. You could even throw your things in the dishwasher if you've got some stainless steel scissors or pruners or something that isn't going to be bothered by that. Well, the other reason I didn't like to use bleach is that it could rust your tools kind of badly, and Lysol isn't going to do that. Okay. So additional prevention measures, I mentioned about that: destroy, avoid, disinfect. Avoiding can also mean avoiding nurseries where you walk in and you see obvious infected plants. Okay, the obvious infected plants you obviously don't want to take, but then what about the rest of them? Is that nursery really doing a good job? And talk to their nursery owners, talk to your workers, share your knowledge, let them know what you know about what it could look like. And you know what? The best thing, if a nursery doesn't listen to you, talk to your agriculture department. So contact whoever is the regulatory body in your state. Like back in Michigan, it was the Michigan Department of Agriculture, and let them know. You can even do online reporting a lot of times now, and they'll go check it out. They always were really good about it if I went and I said something. And, sometimes they'd be like, oh, it's you again, but and if you're wrong, that's fine too. Now, you got to remember, I've had people say, only buy at licensed nurseries. Well, did you know Walmart has a nursery stock license? Because they sell nursery stock. That doesn't mean they know what they're doing or know their plants or anything. But your specialty nurseries are going to know more, and I think they're going to care more, and I think you'll be able to talk to them more. So the other thing as a nursery owner to remember, don't be afraid to quarantine things for a while. Please test things that are coming in. If you're switching suppliers, check the stock. Do a couple tests. Make sure that they're good, okay? And if you're importing plants or not sure, especially, I would quarantine for maybe even 2 years before you start selling them. So, and then remember, if one batch starts showing it, you got to kind of assume that the rest of them do too. All right. So I really hope you guys have had a chance to, absorb this. I hope I didn't scare you off. I know this is a threat to our gardens, threat to hosta nurseries, but really by getting to know what this is, know what to look for, don't panic. I did it successfully. You got to remember, my nursery, the first time I saw it in my nursery stock was 2004. The last time I ever saw it was about 2007. It took a while, but I got rid of it. Testing, checking, quarantining. You know what? I excellent sanitation practices. So hopefully now that's what you know. It's out there. It spreads. It can infect things, but don't let it scare you. Enjoy your hostas, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was great.
All right. Now, you have about 5 minutes left for questions, right?
Yeah. Well, I just let everybody in the attendees know, all of our workshops and presenters are actually being recorded. So we will be able to have the videos later on. All right. And so, one person wanted to know, define scrubbing. And the question is disinfectant wipes. What
Sure.
exactly?
With the disinfectant wipes, I would actually get to the point where I would take the wipes and, repeatedly wash back and forth on my pruners, and you can see green come out on the wipes. And so, you can get to the point where you can see the debris, you can see the plant sap coming off. I don't know if what the time limit is, but I would often keep scrubbing until I saw no more green coming off. And when I would then switch to another clean part of the wipe that was white. And as long as that wipe was coming back white, I felt like I got rid of all the plant sap. So yeah, whenever I was cutting and dividing, that plant sap gets on there and it turns green on the wipe, and I would just keep wiping until I saw no more plant sap. Okay.
Good. Another quick one I think we can do. Is there any evidence of plants becoming resistant?
No, there really isn't. You know, there were no plants that they found to not catch hosta virus X. So, you know, if there's nothing immune to it, no hosta is immune to HVX. I don't see any way that we're going to come up with some hosta that's magically resistant to it. So, unfortunately, that's just the nature of the beast. In fact, hosta virus X, there's different strains that came from different parts of the world. From different sort of native colonies. There was HVX from Korea, HVX from Japan, HVX from China. These things have been around a long time, and so it's not like the hostas have somehow, you know, learned to live with it. It just gets worse almost. So, anyways.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. I'm
Sure.
sorry we don't have more time right now, but we've got some other questions. We'll try to email them to you, and we'll post your answers online. All right. Thank you so very much for taking time today coming. Again, Chris is over in Ireland right now. So the great things of virtual, we get to bring
I absolutely love it. You know, I don't think I would have had a chance to come over and do this. So, you know, it's wonderful. And hopefully we can do it again some other time too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.